Though the actions taken against him were illegal, Jesus endured his trial before the Sanhedrin, the religious authority of his day. He will soon be handed over to the political authority of Rome for final judgment. But while Jesus is the one being judged, in fact, it is his judges who will ultimately be condemned for the rejection. We pick up the story in Mark 15, verse 1. And as soon as it was morning, the chief priests held their consultation with the elders and scribes and the whole council. And they bound Jesus and led him away and delivered him over to Pilate. The trials, sentencing, and abuse Jesus received during the night were all technically illegal by Jewish law. The reason for this short trial in the morning was to confirm their previous verdict and at least make things look legal. They also had to determine what charge to bring to Pilate. While the Sanhedrin could issue a death sentence, they were powerless to carry it out. Only the Roman governor had this power. Besides, it would be better in the eyes of the people if the Romans were the ones to kill Jesus and not the religious leaders. And so they delivered Jesus to Pilate, who was in Jerusalem for Passover, for the final confirmation and execution of their death sentence. We know a lot about Pontius Pilate from outside the New Testament. He first appears in history when he is appointed governor or military commander of Judea and Samaria in AD 26. Like most government appointments, he is probably a middle-aged man who has rose through the ranks of the Roman military. He was apparently an effective ruler, as he will be governor for 10 years, much longer than most people in his position. The first century Jewish historians Josephus and Philo tell us of Pilate's problems with his Jewish subjects. When he first arrived in Judea, his soldiers marched into Jerusalem carrying their Roman standards that bore the image of Caesar. This offended the Jewish people as it was seen as a violation of the second commandment against graven images. 5 days of protest at Pilate's residence in Caesarea ensued. Even the threat of Roman soldiers with their swords drawn for attack could not disperse the crowd of protesters, and so Pilate eventually relented. A second incident occurred sometime later when Pilate placed gold shields with no image but an inscription to the divine Caesar on a wall in Herod's palace. The Jewish leaders sent a protest to the emperor, who will reprimand Pilate and order him to take the shields down immediately. Another time, Pilate uses funds from the temple treasury, or Corban, to build an aqueduct to bring water to Jerusalem. When the people protest what they see as a misuse of sacred temple money, Pilate sends disguised soldiers among the mob. And at his signal, the soldiers attack, and many Jews are beaten and killed before the mob disperses. The Gospel of Luke mentions an unknown Passover uprising where Pilate mingled the blood of Galileans with their sacrifices. Add to this the various small skirmishes between the Roman soldiers and the Jewish zealot freedom fighters, and we see that Pilate had a rocky relationship with his Jewish subjects. But this did not matter to Pilate, for as the records imply, he was an anti-Semitic ruler. He had no problem flaunting Jewish law and killing Jewish people. In fact, in another 3 to 4 years, he will be removed from office and recalled to Rome to answer for his cruelty after a Samaritan uprising. So why does Pilate in the Gospels seem so wishy-washy? Why is he so reluctant to kill Jesus? And why does he eventually give in to the Jewish leaders' demands? The Pilate we read about in secular history would have no problem killing another Jewish wannabe Messiah. I believe one reason may be recent events back in Rome concerning a man called Lucius Aulus Sejanus. The Bible never mentions Sejanus, but his actions play into Pilate's attitude in the trial of Jesus. Sejanus was an ambitious soldier who became a close friend and personal confidant of the Roman Emperor Tiberius. He was the commander of the Praetorian Guard, Tiberius's personal bodyguard, from AD 14 to 31. In AD 26, Tiberius retired from public life to the island of Capri. He left Sejanus in charge of Rome. This gave Sejanus the opportunity to make a grab for ultimate power. He controlled what information reached the emperor, and he moved to eliminate his political enemies. He even tried to marry into the imperial family. Sejanus was now the most important man in the empire. He was the one who now appointed governors for the Roman provinces. Now, he was well known for his hatred of the Jews and therefore would want someone with this attitude to be governor of the Jewish homeland. Pilate is appointed in AD 26, probably by Sejanus, or at least it's Sejanus' suggestion. In AD 31, Sejanus' treasonous activities are finally brought to Tiberius' attention, and he orders his arrest and execution on October 18th, AD 31. Knowing Sejanus' anti-Semitic attitude, the Emperor Tiberius ordered all hostilities against the Jews to cease. And for the next few years, Tiberius is obsessed with tracking down the family and allies of Sejanus. They are all arrested and executed. If Jesus' trial occurred in April of AD 31, as I believe it did, Pilate has fearfully watched for the last 18 months as Sejanus' allies fall one after another. With the bad reports Rome has already received about him, Pilate did not need to draw Tiberius' attention to himself and perhaps suffer the same fate as Sejanus. So when Jesus is brought before him for trial, he is between a rock and a hard place. How can he placate the Jewish religious leaders while also not provoke the crowds who follow Jesus to riot? Verse 2, and Pilate asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" And he answered him, "You have said it." And the chief priests accused him of many things. Knowing the religious charge of blasphemy would be meaningless in a Roman court, the chief priests twisted their charge to treason by saying Jesus claimed to be the king of the Jews. Luke described their charges as follows. He writes, "And they began to accuse him, saying, 'We found this man misleading our nation and forbidding us to give tribute to Caesar, and saying that he himself is Christ, a king.'" Now, none of these charges were accurate, and both the religious leaders and Pilate knew it. Governor Pilate would not have been unfamiliar with Jesus' case. Part of his job was to stay informed of activities in his territory. His spies were everywhere. The crowds that gathered to hear Jesus and the report of miracles would not have been unknown to Pilate. Also, Jesus' triumphal entry into Jerusalem and his cleansing of the temple that week must have reached his ears. While Mark's description of the trial of Jesus is short, John's gospel gives us much more of their interaction. Pilate asked Jesus if he is the king of the Jews because he is trying to ascertain if Jesus is a threat or not. Jesus' answer is cryptic. John records Jesus' words to Pilate this way. In John 18, starting verse 36, Jesus answered, "My kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, my servants would have been fighting, that I might not be delivered over to the Jews. But my kingdom is not from the world." Then Pilate said to him, "So you are a king?" Jesus answered, "You say that I am a king. For this purpose I was born, and for this purpose I have come into the world, to bear witness to the truth. Everyone who is of the truth listens to my voice." And so Jesus affirms that he is a king, but not the way his enemies or Pilate would interpret kingship. His was not an earthly political kingdom, as his enemies are suggesting. Mark 15:4. And Pilate again asked him, "Have you no answer to make? See how many charges they bring against you." But Jesus made no further answer, so that Pilate was amazed. While the chief priests accused Jesus of many things, Jesus remained silent. And this amazes Pilate, as he expected Jesus to defend himself against these charges. It also confirms his suspicions that Jesus is not guilty of any crime. However, Pilate is a man under the gun, so he cannot afford to simply release Jesus and thus anger the religious leaders. And so he tries several alternate plans. Luke records that he first tries to pawn Jesus' case off on Herod Antipas. And when this fails, he next tries substitution. Verse 6, "Now at the feast, he used to release for them one prisoner for whom they asked." Now this custom is not mentioned in any Roman law records. It may have been a Jewish Passover custom that Pilate honored, or a personal custom of Pilate to get on the Jewish people's good side. After all, Passover was the celebration of the Israelites being set free. Wherever the custom came from, Pilate sees it as a chance to get out of his sticky situation. He will let the people decide Jesus' fate. Verse 7, "And among the rebels in prison who had committed murder in the insurrection, there was a man called Barabbas. And the crowd came up and began to ask Pilate to do as he usually did for them." There were probably various names being yelled out for their release. What drew Pilate's attention to Barabbas? Barabbas was a zealot who had been captured in a battle with Roman forces. He'd even murdered for the cause. And so Pilate assumed that the people would surely want Jesus freed over this lowlife. Barabbas' very name may have been another reason for Pilate's choice. In the parallel passage in Matthew's Gospel, many ancient manuscripts give us the full name of this man as Jesus Barabbas. Jesus was a fairly common name in the first century. Here was a man with the same first name. That may be one reason Pilate seems to identify Jesus to the crowd as the King of the Jews. He was giving them a choice. Do you want Jesus Barabbas or Jesus who is called Christ? Here were two men named Jesus who in character were polar opposite to each other. Verse 9, "And he answered them, saying, 'Do you want me to release for you the King of the Jews?' For he perceived that it was out of envy that the chief priests had delivered him up." Pilate realized the reason the religious leaders rejected Jesus was envy. They resented his popularity with the crowds and his threat to their power over the people. Jesus also did not fit their mold for the Messiah. But the greatest reason these religious men hated Jesus was that he exposed them for who they were. He often uncovered their sins and hypocrisy in front of the people, and this they could not tolerate. By repeatedly calling Jesus the King of the Jews, Pilate was probably making a not so subtle jab at the religious leaders' false motives. Mark 15:11. "But the chief priests stirred up the crowd to have him release for them Barabbas instead. And Pilate again said to them, 'Then what shall I do with the man you call the King of the Jews?' And they cried out, 'Crucify him!'" See, what Pilate failed to realize is that To many in the crowd, Barabbas would be considered a hero, a freedom fighter against Rome, and it would be easy for the chief priest to stir up the crowd to cry for Barabbas's release and Jesus' death. Verse 14, and Pilate said to them, "Why? What evil has he done?" But they shouted all the more, "Crucify him!" You know, there's been a lot said about the fickle Jewish crowd. The crowd who cried Hosanna on Palm Sunday now cry crucify him on Friday. However, this idea fails to consider that these are really two different crowds of people. The crowds on Sunday were pilgrims who were coming for Passover, many of whom had traveled with Jesus on the road. This crowd, screaming for his death, was made up of priests and temple cronies that had been assembled by the religious leaders. They would have taken no chances with a mixed crowd at this trial. The whole reason that they had paid Judas to betray Jesus and arrested and tried Jesus at night was for secrecy, to avoid the large crowd of Jesus' followers from finding out. It is still very early in the morning, and much of Jerusalem would just be waking up. This is not unusual, for the Roman authorities usually conducted trials in the morning to free the rest of their day for leisure and recreation. And so there would have been few, if any, in this crowd that would sympathize with Jesus. Verse 15, so Pilate, wishing to satisfy the crowd, released for them Barabbas, and having scourged Jesus, he delivered him to be crucified. So after another failed plan, Pilate tries to get the crowd to show pity on Jesus. John's gospel references that Jesus' scourging and the mocking by the soldiers, which we will discuss in our next lesson, was an attempt to spare Jesus' life. In John 19, after the scourging, we read, Pilate went out again and said to them, "See, I am bringing him out to you, that you may know that I find no guilt in him." So Jesus came out, wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe. Pilate said to them, "Behold the man." And when the chief priests and the officers saw him, they cried out, "Crucify him! Crucify him!" Pilate hoped that this punishment would be enough to satisfy the crowd. But instead, they became like sharks that smell blood in the water. They went into a feeding frenzy. So great was their hatred for Jesus. John records the final straw in Pilate's failed attempts when they claimed to release Jesus showed that Pilate was no friend of Caesar. A not-so-veiled threat to report Pilate to the emperor for condoning the treason of one who claimed to be a king. Pilate finally caves. Though he knew Jesus was innocent, he was not going to risk his career for this peasant preacher. He washes his hands of Jesus and sends him to his death. He wanted to please the crowd more than he wanted to do what was right. Some final thoughts before we leave today. First, the rejected king. The various participants in these events rejected Jesus for a variety of reasons. First, we see the chief priests and the religious leaders rejected Jesus out of envy. They didn't like Jesus' popularity with the people, and they really didn't like Jesus exposing their hidden motives and sins. And many religious people today reject Jesus for the same reasons. They will not receive Christ because they don't want their sins to be exposed. In John 3:19-21, we read, "And this is the judgment, that light has come into the world, and people loved the darkness rather than the light because their works were evil. For everyone who does wicked things hates the light, and does not come to the light, lest his works should be exposed. But whoever does what is true comes to the light, so that it may be clearly seen that his works have been carried out in God." Second, Pilate rejected Jesus out of expediency. He rejected Jesus because he was afraid of losing his position. He cared more about what others thought than doing what was right. Like Pilate, many people today refuse to accept Jesus because they don't want to change their lifestyle. They're comfortable with their sin and they don't want to live for Christ. They would rather please people and please themselves than please God. And third, the Roman soldiers rejected Jesus out of ignorance. I feel the most sorry for these Roman soldiers. They had nothing against Jesus personally. They knew nothing about him except what they had heard during the trial. Their rejection of Jesus was purely out of ignorance. They simply didn't know any better. Their abuse of Jesus was simply something to relieve their boredom. To many today, Jesus and Christianity is just an interesting fad. They don't understand and don't care to discover what it means to follow Christ. This is the saddest rejection of all. A second thought is about the man who missed his cross. Barabbas was guilty. He had been justly tried, sentenced, and condemned. And as he sat in his prison cell awaiting his inevitable death, imagine Barabbas' surprise when the soldiers came, took off his chains, and tell him, "You are free to go. Someone else is dying in your place." Unlike any other person in history, Barabbas knows what it means for Jesus to take his place. The cross on which Jesus died was meant for Barabbas. He died literally in Barabbas' place. I wonder if Barabbas made a trip to Golgotha that day. I wonder if he took a long look at the man who was dying on his cross. While there are many legends about Barabbas' fate, we probably will never know what ultimately happened to him. But Barabbas is a picture of every one of us. We are all condemned and deserving of death, yet Jesus took our place. He was rejected so that we might never be rejected. He died so that we might live. The Apostle Paul put it this way in 2 Corinthians 5:21, "For our sake, he, God the Father, made him, God the Son, to be sin who knew no sin, so that in him we might become the righteousness of God." Have you given thanks and given your life to the one who died in your place?